Hello, everybody. I'm Bob Blumenthal. I'm a member of the JJA board and the chair of the JJA book committee. And for the second year, the organization formed a committee to review as many jazz books published in the prior year as we could, evaluate them, and generate our list of nominees that way. And one of the first things we learned in the first year was not just the number of books, but the number of books worthy of consideration for an award. And one of the things that led us to do is to see if we could come up with a way to to expand the award process. And we think we found a way. Today we're going to hear from 4 authors who are members of the JJA, and it turns out that 2 of them have written biographies, and the other 2 have written other jazz books that are not straight biographies. And that 50-50 split reflects almost perfectly the division among the books we've been reading this year. Half tend to be either biography or autobiography. The other half come into an area that we have dubbed history, criticism, or culture. And we've decided that this year, rather than one book award, there would be 2 awards, one for the best jazz biography or autobiography, and one for the best book of jazz history, criticism, or culture. And so we have, as I say, an ideal reflection of that mix among the 4 authors we're going to be speaking to today. The plan of the event is to devote some time initially to each of the 4 authors, talk about their writing careers and their books, and to then perhaps have some questions that we can get interaction among them and get some questions from those of you who are just observing. So let me start by introducing the 4 authors we're going to be speaking to and holding up their books. The first is Deanna Witkowski, who wrote a book simply titled Mary Lou Williams. Then we're going to hear from Jordannah Elizabeth, whose book is called She Raised Her Voice, 50 Black Women Who Sang Their Way into Music History, with illustrations by Briana Denguoie. Is that it?
I believe so. I say Denogue, but I'm not.
Well, then Bill Milkowski, who wrote Ode to a Tenor Titan, The Life and Times and Music of Michael Brecker. And then, not one but 2 from Debbie Burke, who wrote Klezmer for the Joyful Soul and Volume 2 of Tasty Jazz Jams for Our Times. So that's the plan. And Howard, did I see you were back on? I guess only momentarily.
Yes, so I'm on.
I just wondered if you had any remarks before we got going.
No, we're happy to have everybody attend this blog, this Zoom meeting. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will try to convey them to the conversation when it's appropriate. And for people who are on Facebook, if you post your questions at Facebook, I hope that Leslie, our social media director, will convey those also to the chat here. And again, I'm hearing feedback on my end, so that's probably not helpful. Right, Bob?
Okay, I think we're ready to go. Without further ado, Deanna, Mary Lou Williams. I want to start by asking everyone to give us a brief biography, resume, just sort of general background of your career.
Sure. Well, thanks, Bob, and I'm really happy to be here. I want to make one correction that actually the full title of the book is Mary Lou Williams and the subtitle is Music for the Soul. This is a book that's part of a series by Liturgical Press, which is a Catholic publisher. They have a series called People of God that's meant for general audiences, and it's each subject in each volume is on a Catholic. So this is a very big part of the book, is focusing on Mary Lou's spirituality, but also meant to be something that people who either know Mary Lou's music or don't know her music, that everyone has different entry points. So I am primarily a jazz pianist and composer, and my writing has mostly been doing a lot of my own writing, doing, copy and things like that. I'm also a PhD student in jazz studies at the University of Pittsburgh, following Mary Lou's story. Led me here. This is where Mary Lou is from. And in fact, I think I told Bob that a few months after I bought my house here, I learned that Mary Lou's gravesite is exactly a mile from my house. So I've gone and paid my respects on several visits. But I also wrote the liner notes for, I'm going to hold this up. I also have a new recording called Force of Nature that's coming out on MCG Jazz next Friday, the 28th. And it features 11 compositions by Mary Lou, some of which haven't been recorded since the 40s. And so Marty Ashby at MCG really wanted me to write the liner notes, because Mary Lou, this book came about not because I pitched it to this publisher, but the publisher contacted me because of articles they'd found online that I'd written about Mary Lou, and they were particularly interested in the fact that some parallels that I share with Mary Lou is not just being a jazz musician and a jazz pianist, but I'm also an adult convert to Catholicism. And that kind of happened in literally the very same places where Mary Lou was influenced in New York, at certain Jesuit parishes, at St. Francis Xavier in Chelsea and St. Ignatius Loyola on the Upper East Side. So I'm really conversant in this kind of milieu, and really got more in depth into her spiritual journey in this book.
Well, one thing that struck me about the book is that I learned more about her service, if you will, to the church and to the community, which was always alluded to when you read about Mary Lou Williams. It must have opened up a whole new area of research for you in terms of just putting the book together. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I got interested in Mary Lou, over 20 years ago. So Dr. Bailey Taylor had invited me to play at the Mary Lou Williams Festival at the Kennedy Center in 2000. And at that time, I really did not know Mary Lou's music very much. And I really feel like that's still an issue with a lot of musicians, even because, no one calls Mary Lou tunes to play. Her compositions aren't as well known. So I started doing research, kind of more general research back then. I read Linda Dahl's biography that had just come out on Mary Lou called Morning Glory. And the entry point for me in reading that book was really, I've also written a couple of jazz masses. And when I found out Mary Lou had written all this liturgical music in the 60s and 70s, I was like, wow, this is great. I have to go check this stuff out. So I went to the Institute of Jazz Studies, like starting in 2000, and I listened to cassettes of her first two masses that have never been recorded still, that she did like at churches in Rochester and Newark and all these places. And but definitely one of the really cool things I went really in depth with, and I also have a grant from Notre Dame to do another project on this, is realizing Mary Lou's very extensive letter correspondence, and that correspondence that she had with women religious, with nuns, is really amazing. So Mary Lou took a lot of spiritual retreats while she was, in between gigs or when she was on the road. And she started doing this in the early 60s. And every time she would go on a retreat, like say at a retreat center run by the Senecal sisters, she would befriend one of the sisters and then would start a letter correspondence. And I really found that there was this whole network of women who were really important to supporting her in her career. And Mary Lou was also like that in terms of letter correspondence is what got her started with working with the diocese here in Pittsburgh to found the first jazz festival here in 1964. And Mary Lou was just someone who was very, very determined and had a lot of faith in the power of her music and the power of jazz and spirituality of jazz and the power of her ideas. And she was also just a very generous person, and you see that in her letter writing. And that was something that's been really amazing for me to delve into.
What about the skeptic who says, you know, I'm really into the music, and there are these other biographies of Mary Lou Williams. So as far as the music goes, what have you uncovered about her, do you think?
Well, there's definitely stuff in here that's not in the earlier biographies. So for instance, and frankly, I really, I don't believe that, you know, one musician should just have two biographies necessarily either. But so Mary Lou, you know, we probably all know that Melba Liston worked with her quite a bit, of course, with like arranging movements from the Zodiac Suite for Dizzy in 1957. But one of the cool things I saw when I visited the Liston archives at Columbia College Chicago was beginnings of sketches that Liston was doing for the Zodiac Suite to have Monk play with his quintet and various chamber music instrumentations. So Liston had gone through and she grouped the 12 zodiac signs in 3 sections, so 4 in each. She made listings of like adjectives that she felt described these sections, and she started writing sketches. I don't know, I've been trying to find out, and I haven't been able to follow that thread further yet as to what happened with that, but that's something that I've never really seen discussed or alluded to.
Okay, you also told me about some discoveries you made in Pittsburgh, right? The letters, and just her documents.
Her letters with.
Well, you said you found some things that were just sort of wasting away that had been left.
Oh, so well, that was a few years ago when. So I moved here from New York. I was in New York for 23 years, so this is a big change, being in the hills of Pittsburgh. So yeah, I was doing a concert maybe like, I'm going to guess about 8 years ago in Jersey City at St. Peter's University. And that's where the late Father Peter O'Brien, who was Mary Lou's manager for the last 20 or so years of her life, taught. And in the rectory there, where the priest who also taught at the university lived, this was after Father O'Brien had passed. So I was doing a Mary Lou themed concert there, and one of the priests who attended said, did you know there's all these artifacts or possessions of Mary Lou's in the basement of the rectory? And I was like, what? So he showed me, and there was this big table. There was like a painting of Mary Lou. There were things that looked like manuscripts. I mean, I didn't touch anything. I didn't, whatever. But so at that point, I contacted the late Jerry Allen, and I let her know that the stuff was sitting there, and would there be any way that the foundation, Mary Lou Williams Foundation, could get this material over to her archives at the Institute of Jazz Studies. So they did do that. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks. Again, Music for the Soul, Mary Lou Williams, is Deanna's book. And thank you very much for that conversation. Now I wanted to go to Jordannah Elizabeth's book, again, as she raised her voice. 50 Black women who sang their way into music history. So welcome again, Jordannah.
Hi, Bob. Thank you for all the attendees, and to the book panel, and everyone who is, I guess, making an informed decision on the award winners. So I appreciate being in the running and a part of this community. Yes, she raised her voice like Deanna. Hachette, Running Press Kids, reached out to me to write this book. And I guess it derives, I know it derives from 10 years of my prior work of working on the historical presence, and using a platform to uplift Black women in alternative genres outside of rock and roll and R&B, classical music, soul, folk, jazz. So I guess about 2013, I began my work at Bitch Media, which is a feminist publication, and I was a music journalist. And my first piece was 5 Black women musicians to know. And I believe Betty Carter was on there, and Abby Lincoln, and a few people. And that work continued throughout a number of publications: LA Weekly, New York Amsterdam News, Village Voice. So I've been documenting Black women in jazz and Black women in other genres for my entire professional career. I am very young. I'm 35 years old. But I started in the music industry at 17 years old as a musician. I managed bands, I promoted bands in New York City and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And so I have a lot of experience interacting and working with bands and understanding them compositionally, and really getting into the process, and particularly with Black women, doing more than just writing a list, but creating an existential, creating a reality-based, empathetic engagement with the experience of what it is to be a Black woman in music. And I think that it is very important, as one of the rare African American Black women jazz critics, that I lend my understanding, empathy, and experience, engaging with the music, engaging with a male dominated, a white dominated community. And really giving a historical and understanding of celebration um, of many women who have not been heralded in history, and many who have.
Okay. Now, when you talk about a diverse audience and diverse community, if people aren't familiar with the book, and I don't know if you can get the sense, but you might, that it's beautifully illustrated. It contains, I think you could call them capsule biographies because they're not extended essays. And it, it really speaks to a reading audience that many jazz books don't address. Could you talk a bit about that? And as a journalist who's written for other audiences, how you had to adjust your approach for this book?
Yes, the book is called a middle grade children's book. Middle grade connects with readers who are between 8 and 12 years old, and can stretch to about 9 to 13 or 14 before we get into young adults. And yes, they are capsule uh, biographies. Um, the publisher really wanted 300 words, and I just did the work and extended them to about 500 to 600 words on my own. How do you put a 90-year-old woman's life into 300 words? So I guess I, gave myself more work, but it was a pleasure. Writing for children is really fun. I feel, even though I am definitely a full-on adult, I love my job, and I have a childlike wonderment and curiosity in regards to learning about music, engaging with music, studying music, talking to musicians, going to shows. I feel like I have the best job in the world, and I feel like it's a blast. So writing the book was definitely tough. I had 3 months to write 50 biographies. And I really just sat down and went through an organized manner. But in regards to writing to diverse audiences. I think this book is great for adults and children, but writing directly to children felt natural. Um, it allowed me to really focus on the accomplishments of the woman more than the trauma. Um, a lot of the women experienced, uh, you know, issues with drug abuse and domestic violence, and manipulation, and many things that had gone on in their career, particularly women like Billie Holiday, who have this very heavy story. And we kind of, identify these women with their tragedy and their trauma, and it was just really fun to be lighter and to let kids know that these women are more than the pain that they've been through. They are geniuses, they are forces of nature. They are not only singers, they are composers, arrangers, producers, songwriters, band leaders. And it was just really great to get into that.
Okay. Trying to read the chat comments at the same time I'm listening. Not a good idea. But I wanted to also ask you about why 50 and why these 50, and that whole process of deciding who the book's going to be about and how to present the story.
Yeah, the publisher came up with the rough title. They wanted 50 women, and they had a rough list. And I was able to kind of go through and rework it, and add in people, like we talked about, Betty Carter, and Abby Lincoln, and of course we have Ella Fitzgerald and Etta James, and many others who are kind of more known. But I wanted to get in a couple of jazz singers who weren't as well known. But so I came up with the title. I wrote about 5 different choices for the publisher, and they came upon She Raised Her Voice. Why did I choose She Raised Her Voice? Ideas just kind of come to me from the ether. I do this job because it's very natural, and I get to be very creative and imaginative. So writing the book is also fun because, I don't want to get too clinical about information. History is important, details are incredibly important, but this music is fun. And it's important. So, it was a process, but I got the list cleared up, I got the title out, and boom, I had to really run through it in 90 days. And I actually sat down and wrote it in about 4 weeks, after just kind of thinking about it and letting things soak in. So it was an incredible process. It was an emotional process. There were times where I cried. There were times where I broke down, being so engaged in these emotional experiences of these women, and seeing, how unfair and how tragic some of their deaths really were, and how tied into misogyny and racism. You know, I I I I saw a pattern that women who were born before the civil rights movement and the second wave feminist movement tended to live much shorter and die in more mysterious and tragic ways than many of the women who were born in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. Of course, we still deal with things to this day. Of course, I still deal with things to this day, but I noticed some disparities and some interesting uh, uh, ways that women had passed away that um, were profound and incredibly sad.
But the book really does, I won't say avoid those topics, but it doesn't dwell on those topics. And it's
Absolutely not.
kind of refreshing to see Bessie Smith presented where her death doesn't become, a
Mm-hmm.
third of the story, or
Mm-hmm.
Dinah Washington and her problems with her husbands.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as I told you before, I was introduced to a few women, particularly the non-American musicians you represent. I wonder if you were introduced to anyone along the way.
Um, I was not. All of these women were women that I was familiar with. So this is my work. This is my life. I've been, into finding Black girls in different genres of music because I was different. I grew up as a little girl into rock and roll, into punk music, into hip hop, into jazz, into folk, into country, and into all of these things. So I think as I was a little girl, I was always looking for women who looked like me in alternative spaces. So Skin is a hard rock lead singer. She's this beautiful, tall, black, bald, you know, um, different, looking woman. And she has this operatic, gorgeous voice over this hard kind of metal rock music. And then Ari Up of the band The Slits was actually a protege of Joe Strummer of the Clash. This is kind of the punk scene, and the stories, we don't exactly know who her father is, but there are stories that she may have been an illegitimate daughter of Jimi Hendrix. Um, and she wrote this song "Typical Girls," where she was just kind of singing about being different than the typical girl who liked magazines and who'd like perfume and like all of these things. So I was always looking, and people like Betty Carter, who was like this force of nature on stage. Dropping Things is one of my favorite like songs. The way she's just, you don't hear anything, like her. So my entire life, I've been looking for women like this. So by the time the book came, even though it's fun and it's light, I, grew up with I guess I garnered a somewhat of an encyclopedic understanding of Black women in music, just
Okay.
naturally.
Well, it's a different slant than many of the jazz books that we've looked at, and it's a great example of why we felt we had to basically come up with more than one award to acknowledge the variety among quality jazz books. And so now I want to turn to Bill Milkowski, whose book is both behind him and in front of me at the moment. The Ode to a Tenor Titan. And Bill and I have known each other for a while, but for those who I can't believe there are any who are not familiar with his work, but why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Bill Mulkowski. I'm originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And that's where I began writing about music in the 70s. First for my campus newspaper, UWM Post. And then I got an internship at the Milwaukee Journal and began covering music in the features department, which developed into sort of a full-time gig over the next couple of years. This was 76 to 79. And that's where I began interviewing, all kinds of musicians, not just jazz, but I did interview Keith Jarrett and Barney Kessel, but also Dolly Parton and, all kinds of pop musicians and folk musicians. I moved to New York in 1980 and began connecting on that scene with a lot of musicians, and have been writing for Downbeat magazine for some decades. I actually placed my first story with them in 76. So that was 100 years ago. Began writing regularly for Downbeat in like early 80s, 83, I think it was. And continue to write for Downbeat today. I've also written for numerous publications, Jazz Times, Jazz Is, Interview Magazine. I write now for Absolute Sound and Guitar Player. I've written over 1,000 sets of liner notes. several thousand stories over the years. And this book on Michael Brecker is my 8th book. So, and it's the 3rd that I've done for this publisher, Backbeat. So I've sort of established a working relationship with the people at Backbeat, and which made it a lot easier to suggest and get the green light to go ahead and do this Mike Brecker book. I had previously done a biography on Jaco Pastorius for them, and co-authored Pat Martino's autobiography, which came out in 2015. And yeah, so Backbeat is, it's interesting how these publishers change through the years. When I did my book, well, actually, when I did the Jaco Pastorius book in 1995, it was Miller Freeman Publications, a publisher on San Francisco, which basically owned a string of magazines, Bass Player, keyboard, guitar player. They had a book division, and the Jaco book came out on Miller Freeman. It was then purchased by Hal Leonard, and then the book was, I did a second edition, 10th anniversary edition in 2005, which was really a complete rewrite. It's twice as long. That came out on Backbeat. The Pat Martino book came out on Backbeat, and then right before I began working on this Michael Brecker project, Backbeat was purchased by a British company called Roman and Littlefield, which I guess gives it more publicity strength and marketing abilities. So now it's still Backbeat in name and the same crew of people that I've worked with in the past, but it's under the umbrella of this British corporation. So there is a London office there, but the main stateside office is in New Jersey. So yeah, the book is, I got the go ahead in January, February, it's right before the pandemic. No, I'm sorry, in 2019. These years are blurring now. I began working on the book in 2019, spent all of that year interviewing about 100 people, family, friends, colleagues of Michael Brecker's. And then 2020, the pandemic, the lockdown, I would have been locked down anyway, because I was working on this book 8 to 10 hours a day, transcribing 100 interviews and shaping it up into a narrative, and finally delivering the manuscript in December of 2020. It finally came out. There were certain delays because of the pandemic, and it finally came out in October of last year. The actual shipping of the books was a drag because the COVID affected the warehouse. The personnel was down, and so while the official release date was October 1st, the books were not in the hands of certain influential critics until like a month later, which was a big drag. But since then, it's been getting a lot of notice, and I'm beginning to do a lot of remote interviews and lectures, Zoom things. I haven't done any in-store book signings. I don't even know if that's a thing anymore. But yeah, so this finally has come to fruition. I have called it my love letter to Mike. He was a friend and a hero to me. I knew him very well, got to know him well after I moved to New York. I first saw him play. Of course, I knew the Brecker Brothers music growing up. It was something that was of the moment in the 70s. I didn't see him visually until 79 when he played with Joni Mitchell on the Shadows and Light tour, which was a fantastic band with Pat Metheny on guitar, Lyle Mays on keyboards, Jaco Pastorius on bass, and Don Elias on drums. That was my first sighting of Michael, all 6'4.5" man, maybe 150 pounds, incredibly thin, tall, wiry and intensely powerful tenor sax player. So after I moved to New York in 1980, I began hanging out a lot at the club that Michael and Randy owned called 7th Avenue South, where they each played in different configurations. But it was sort of a great hang that was open till the wee hours. I would say it was sort of like a fusion version of Bradley's, where people would just start rolling in at 2 and 3 in the morning, and the music is still going. Through that hang, I got to know Michael, got to know his playing better, and finally interviewed him for the first time in 1982 when he appeared on this really beautiful, very powerful project, Klaus Ogerman's music, Cityscape, orchestral music written for Michael's voice in a similar way that Gil Evans wrote for Miles Davis on Sketches of Spain and others. That was my first sit-down interview with Mike, and I found him to be very, humble, almost self-deprecating, and it was at odds with his just incredible, prodigious nature as this jaw-dropping instrumentalist who was such an influential figure. Man, when you get somebody that virtuosic and at the same time he's humble, it's a rare combination. Of course, Jocko was the exact opposite. He was, the first one to tell you, I'm the greatest bass player in the world. He walked up to Ron Carter and introduced himself that way. Hi, I'm Jocko Pastorius, the greatest bass player in the world. This is the polar opposite of Mike, who was forever finding fault with his own playing after soloing and apologizing to people in the studio. Oh, I'll do another take. And meanwhile, people are picking their jaws up off the ground because of what he just laid out. So yeah, it was my love letter to Mike. I really wanted to lift him up in this book. And one of the things that I found, which was shocking to me, I knew him. I knew his music intimately. I was pals on the phone with him. We exchanged all kinds of hilarious stories. But in getting into this book, I didn't know that he was a very bad heroin addict for a decade. This was news to me. So that presents the question, as the writer of this biography, do I want to go there? Is this verboten? How do I address this? What I discovered was that rather than just being a dark, salacious story, this was a redemptive story, because Mike went into rehab. And when he came out in January of 1982, he not only dedicated the rest of his life to staying clean and sober, he took a lot of people with him, helped a lot of people get on the good foot and get clean, lead clean and sober lives, hundreds of people. And I interviewed many who said, Michael saved my life. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here today. Several prominent musicians. He was a caring figure, and like I say, he dedicated those remaining 25 years of his life to helping others while also developing his compositional prowess and developing as a musician, and just a real beloved figure on the scene. I was proud to say that I knew him, and happy that I did my best in telling his story and interviewing the inner circle of people, and Michael's widow, Susan Brecker, and people like David Liebman and others who, of course, Randy Brecker, to get some inside looks at this remarkable, incredible, virtuosic musician.
Okay, well, you've touched on a lot of the things I wanted to ask you about, but just to show that I had some questions to put forward, you said you wanted to lift Mike up and celebrate him, and I wonder if how you feel he's been judged critically or popularly, if you will, within the development of the music and saxophone playing and just his overall influence.
Well, that's an interesting question, and Ted Gioia addressed that recently in an essay on his really wonderful blog, The Honest Broker. Um, he read this book that I sent him, and he came up with the notion that although Michael was revered by fellow musicians and especially saxophonists and students of the saxophone, there was a gap, a discrepancy between how he was perceived by, now he called it, it wasn't the jazz press because Downbeat did many cover stories on Michael, but he said the mainstream media didn't regard Michael in the same way that they did other great jazz musicians. And even today, you know, like he pointed to the New Yorker as a magazine that brings to fruition the names of up and coming, promising, brilliant young musicians, whether it's Jason Moran or Joshua Redman or whoever. And yet his contention was they never printed a single word about Mike. Now, why is this? And his theory, and others had suggested this as well, you know, Michael was a very profoundly gifted musician who was hugely inspired by John Coltrane. But there was another aspect of his playing, and a lot of that train aspect came out on his own projects as a leader. But he did over 900 sessions as a studio musician for people like Chaka Khan and P-Funk and Cameo, James Brown, Carly Simon, Todd Rundgren, Bruce Springsteen, the list goes on, where Michael was either part of a tight section with his brother Randy and maybe David Sanborn, or he was punching in the perfectly crafted 30, 40-second solo in the context of a tight pop song. And for this reason, it was suggested that he was overlooked by jazz purists for the fact that he did travel in these pop settings, you know, incredibly, so many sessions, literally 900. That's overlooking his contribution on his own recordings, which I feel, you know, beginning with Dreams and the Brecker Brothers, which was sort of commercial funk fusion, grew into showing him blossoming as a composer on his own recordings as a leader, beginning in '87. At a later time in his life, he was 37 by the time he recorded his first album. And then coming into fruition with later projects like he did a recording for 15-piece band that he called it the Quindectet. Um, uh, uh, that was just a beautiful example of his blossoming as a composer, wide angles. And then his very last recording, his Swan Song, he sadly came off a deathbed to record his final album, Pilgrimage. He had been off the scene for 2 years, had this very terrible bone marrow cancer that he was fighting, trying to get a donor for a transplant to save his life. But he came back. He got a half match from his daughter, which really extended his life for another 6 months and gave him the strength to come off this sick bed and come out of radiation to record his final album with Herbie Hancock and Pat Metheny, John Petitucci, Brad Meldau. Very tellingly, it was the only album of his career that he did all the compositions on. And sadly, it was released posthumously. He passed in January 13th of 2007, and it came out in February and won a posthumous Grammy, his 15th by that point. But I would argue to the people that maybe dismissed Mike for delving into the studio scene of the 70s and early 80s, or picking up the EWI, the electronic wind instrument, which was a wholly different, separate part of his career. For those that wrote him off for those the travesties of playing pop music and playing this electronic wind instrument. Check out his last two albums for depth of the compositional element was very deep and the playing was incredibly passionate. And I think that those two albums, and among others, his string of recordings on Impulse in the late 80s, early 90s were also profound. But those in particular, as in a compositional sense, I think should not be overlooked and not dismissed, jazz purist or whoever.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bill. And for our last author, we have not one but two volumes of Debbie Burks. And Debbie, you're still with us? I'm on full screen, so I can't tell.
Yeah, I'm here. Hello.
There you go.
Hi.
Debbie has written two books, and I'm going to start with Klezmer for the Joyful Soul. But maybe you could introduce yourself with that in mind. Then we'll start with
Sure.
that, move on to
Sure.
jams.
Yep, you got it. So I would say my jazz career really began when I took up saxophone at the New School for Social Research, or so it was called, in New York City in '87. And, I took some private lessons and kind of, played around with it, but nothing really formal. And then several years later, joined a university community band in East Stroudsburg, which is the Poconos in PA, and was playing for several years in their jazz band. That's Alto Sax, in their jazz band and community band and so on. And while I was there, I just was learning more about the community around me and found out that there were, David Liebman, Phil Woods, Bob Duro, Rick Chamberlain, so many jazz personalities who would either live there or come through the gates at the Deerhead Inn, which is an iconic place for players since, the 20s and so on. So that was my start in writing, and that was nonfiction. My first book was The Poconos in B flat. But anyway, I have a background in journalism. I was the editor of Business Journal, a news writer, a columnist, the editor of a magazine, lifestyle magazine. So I have a long, 63, so I have a long career in publishing, in media, PR, and so on. And once I got bitten by the bug to write that first book of the Pocono scene, Northeast PA, it just, kind of rolled out from there. And in order to build what they call like an author's platform, I just started a blog. So in 2016, I started a blog. There's over 400 interviews now with all subgenres of jazz, and also from artists all around the world. So that was, that led to ultimately Tasty Jazz Jams 1, and we'll talk about Tasty Jazz Jams 2 in a couple of minutes. The journey to Klezmer was, very personal to me. I have a notebook about the genealogy of my family, my father's side from Lvov, and I started musing about what was music like over there, way before my time, and did a little, research. I had heard Klezmer through the years, just snippets of it. We all know Fiddler on the Roof, all that kind of stuff, and I just thought it would bring me a little closer to my background. And I decided to examine not just a little bit about the historic, but about the contemporary scene. And as some others here have mentioned, what's been going on in music since lockdown has really, everything's taken kind of a real shift. So what are live musicians to do during lockdown and so on? So some of the things that I found are, people, whether it's in the Klezmer world or, straight ahead jazz and so on, contemporary, is that people were, live streaming. They were figuring out ways to get their music out to the masses, doing a lot of live appearances. There were backyard concerts that were held. This was particularly the case with some of the Klezmer groups I was speaking to, that they just went wherever they lived in Long Island or Ohio or where was one, Quebec. They would just go to, among their neighborhoods and so on, their region, and just play as the weather and the seasons would permit. So that's part of what I examined in actually both of these books, how the the scene itself has kind of made a shift. Of course, you had a lot of closures of clubs. You had clubs that were on the, teetering on the brink. People got back to, if they reopened, people got back to playing gigs. And, I think we're over the worst of that kind of, situation where it really, put the livelihoods of musicians, at risk.
Okay.
And so,
I noticed on the back of Tasty Jazz Jams, you're holding an alto sax. And
Yeah.
is that your only instrument, your primary instrument? What do you play?
yeah, it's Yamaha. I started out with a Con, a student model, and I bought it from Manny's at 47th Street in New York, when I started in 1987. And I just sold it for, a pittance, and now, I have a Yamaha. I don't play a lot. I just noodle around for myself. But
Okay.
I
You mentioned that you came to Klezmer through jazz, basically. You were.
I did because I love clarinet also. I learned clarinet in 4th grade, but nothing to really talk about, But just the bending of notes and the feel of a certain flavor of music that is related to and harkens to like cantorial music and different modes that are really emphasized in klezmer and also in jazz, but they're it's a different flavor of it. And I just thought it would be interesting to riff off that and learn more about my background in the process and talk to some really interesting people, fascinating people.
Well, I was going to ask if your jazz background gave you a different perspective on klezmer than another author's book about klezmer might present.
Well, it puts you in a different mood. It puts you in a different frame of mind. There's not that kind of, soloing and improv and stuff that would happen in jazz. That's not going to happen in klezmer. There are prescribed certain ways that, the melody's written and so on. But within those confines, you do find the creativity, I don't know how to pronounce it, the krek, which is a certain way of phrasing a note on the clarinet, and certain devices that they'll use just to show their, to express themselves in a way that the actual melody can't be expanded, but they can do certain, techniques.
One of the things that the two books have in common are they're basically collections of interviews. And so maybe we could transition into talking about your process of how you collect material for your books, and then with a little focus on the Jazz Jams book, if you would.
Yeah, sure. Since I started the blog in 2016, it was a labor of love, and I didn't want to dread producing content for the blog. And I thought the only way to do that is to do a Q&A kind of style, which is, cut and dried, sending questions out and getting them back, editing them, clarifying if need be, and so on. In certain rare instances, like for Ron Carter, he wanted to do a phone convo. And in general, I don't like to do phone conversations, but not for the reason you may think. I don't want to do phone conversations because I get so immersed, and as you know, the conversation can just go on and on and on for hours, that I had to find a way to rein this in to produce a body of work that didn't drive me crazy and allowed me to move on to other things. So that was the model I did, with a few exceptions, like I said, on phone or by Zoom with certain artists. And that has worked for me, to get like interesting questions out and, study the musicians and look at their discography and see how, ask them things like, how has your playing changed over the past decades, let's say, for some of the iconic players, or for some of the emerging players, like what is the scene like for a brand new, someone new on the scene who's just hitting the clubs. So I think that allows me flexibility while presenting it in a very digestible manner for the reader.
Okay. Now, I mentioned to you that in both of the Jazz Jam volumes, needless to say, in the Klezmer volumes, you deal with a lot of artists that I'm not familiar with. And I wonder how you find them, or do they find you, and how you then choose who to write about and prepare for those people.
Yeah, thanks for that question, by the way. Yeah, a variety of ways. At this point, several years into writing about jazz, and also that my blog is actually out and, has a pretty nice following. I am on the receiving end, Terry Hinty and, a whole lot of promotional types of people, as well as the artists themselves. So I have amassed a big media list and list of musicians. And I tell them just to throw me everything. And once in a while, I'll be able to stop and listen to their music and so on. How do I choose? I mean, that's why I'm planning a Pacey Jazz Jams Volume 3 in the near future, and so on. I mean, it's very hard. One thing I did realize, and that I was sure to bring to Volume 2, is that I needed more female instrumentalists in jazz, and especially not vocalists and not pianists, only because they were overrepresented in my past, writings. I wanted to get, a harpist and a, obviously sax, trumpet, trombone, drums, and so on. So I try to mix it up, get a diversity in both, race, age, and gender.
Okay. We're almost at the 3:00 hour. And I did want to, before we get questions from our viewers, I wanted to just throw one out to everybody. Maybe we could answer in the sequence that we've talked already. I know that at least two of you are full-time journalists, Jordannah and Bill, and the other two have other gigs besides writing books. So writing a book, being the monumental project that it is, has to fit into the rest of life and just, gigs, working and producing other things, and how each of you work that into your schedules. Let me start with Deanna.
That's a great question. And when the publisher contacted me about writing the biography, and I told them, I said, I'm not going to get a sabbatical from a university position or, anything like that. I mean, he told me, well, we'll give you as much time as you need. So, I mean, as my primary work is as a musician, and I was working on this during the pandemic, it was hard because frankly, I was applying for emergency grants because I lost all my touring. I lost most of my concerts. And then while I was in the last 8 months of finishing the book, I started a full-time doctoral program in Pittsburgh. So honestly, I just somehow figured out, and I did this over 3.5 years, but I just had to really figure out how to compartmentalize. And I also had an accountability group for at least about 6 months. I went to a writing workshop in Collegeville, Minnesota. And after the workshop, there were about 6 of us that every morning at 6:30, we had Facebook check-ins. We said, hi, I'm here. I'm about to start working. And an hour later, we would just check in again and say what we did and, probably keep working, but whatever. Just having that was actually a really big help.
Okay. Jordannah.
Yes, it is a great question. I did want to answer Joe's question about my relationship with the illustrator, Briana, really quickly. The publisher connected us. Briana lives in Philadelphia and went to Maryland Institute College of Art, where I've taught and done a number of workshops. But unfortunately, we never had the pleasure of meeting. It was all kind of through our publisher and her agent. I'm unagented. I just go with the flow. In regards to being a full-time freelance journalist, it's my life. It's what I do. I have the strangest time management regimen. I'm actually one of those writers who is very unique, lives by my own clock, lives by my own reality. This morning, I just did Saturday chores. That's what I do to clear my mind. I make time for friends and family, but it's kind of definitely hard to explain. I wake up in the morning and just get it done. I think with She Raised Her Voice, waiting for the last 4 weeks was really important. One part of my process is that I kind of have this compartmentalized brain where while I'm walking and doing mundane things, I'm putting together an article, I'm putting together a thesis. I'm kind of, it's almost like this puzzle that's going on in kind of the back of my head. And so that time where I'm doing whatever I do throughout the day, things are being worked out. And I also have conversations with other journalists and family members. And, through conversation, through experience, I kind of glean the information that I need. But yeah, I'm one of those kind of far out writers. I'm definitely personality wise pretty together, pretty grounded, but there's no rhyme or reason. I just enjoy it. It's very natural. I've loved writing since I learned how to do it. So it's kind of, maybe one day we'll do a day in the life and we can just Zoom and you can follow me around doing random. This is very hard to lock down.
We can all be followed around and Debbie can collect our daily experiences. Bill, how about you?
Well, I haven't, wait a minute, how does this work? Why am I not on the screen?
You are.
I'm only seeing you. Okay, whatever.
We see you. We see you.
Oh, okay.
You can go to gallery.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was gonna say I haven't had a real job since 1982. I've been working at home as a freelance music writer since then. And, I've maintained a good living doing it by developing connections over time in various magazines in both the States and Japan and Italy and other places, Germany. I've been writing a column in a German magazine for the last 25 years. So I'm constantly writing about music, which is hardly work in a certain way. But when it comes to writing a book, I get into a total immersion, sort of tunnel vision thing. And in this case of the Michael Brecker book, it was not only immersing myself in the stories that I was getting from these interviews, 100 interviews, but also the music itself, listening to every aspect of I listened to all the side sessions that Mike played on and all the Brecker Brothers stuff and all the various configurations. So that was immersion of music and writing and just living with Mike for 2 years, really, the amount of time that I was doing the interviews and then writing the book. And it was because I knew this guy. It was touching in many ways to revisit some of these feelings and memories and stories with other people about this beautiful cat. And one thing that I will say about this is the first time that I've done a book where I used a transcription service. I've never done that before. I've only ever transcribed all my own interviews, whether they were in person or on the phone. But Evan Haga, who is a former editor of Jazz Times magazine, when he heard that I was talking to him at I think it was the Jazz Congress in 2019. He said, "You should check out the service Trint.com, TRINT, British company. It's a great transcription service and it's relatively cheap." So that was helpful. It really speeded up the process for me. It's sort of drudgery. Like Debbie said, if you get on the phone with somebody, you tend to get into a conversation. And this is true of even if I'm doing a 700 word piece for Downbeat, I might talk to somebody for 2 hours. I don't need all that. but I like the flow and the exchange of ideas and have it be more of a conversation than a
Right.
question and answer thing. So often I'll get carried away and I'm transcribing, I went over to Dave Liebman's house in Pennsylvania, and that thing was like 3.5 hours. Another guy was 6 hours, and this is sort of, it's rough to transcribe that, but this service helped, although it's not accurate and I had to clean it up, and it was laughable how many skewed interpretations of phrasing that this thing came up with. But it was a great help in speeding up the process in this whole writing aspect of this book, this whole total immersion thing. So yeah, it was, for me, it's what working at home is what I've been doing since 1982. It's very familiar. It's just a question of pulling it all together with the focus. And then of course, during that time, I had continuous outside jobs for Downbeat and Guitar Player and Jazzes and others. Those were distractions. It was from, being totally in Mike Brecker world, and suddenly I might have to step out and do liner notes or something just to be able to keep my flow going. But yeah, it's my process has always been about, on these big projects, it's been about total immersion, and it works for me.
Okay. Debbie.
Yeah, well, I would chalk it up to occasional insomnia. I've been self-publishing since my last 5 out of 7 books. And so I do the whole process. And that's, while it's time consuming, not only to be in the process of writing, gathering, interviewing, and so on, self-editing, then sending it out to edit, then formatting and uploading my books. It's a pretty big job, but my mainstay is I run an editing service company. So at any given time, I'll have 5 manuscripts that I'm working on, fiction, nonfiction. Sometimes they're about music, which is really fun. So I'm really busy. I get up when my husband's alarm goes on, and I prop myself up in bed and start writing it or editing at 5 in the morning. Weekends. So but like, others have said here, we're totally, if you're immersed in it and you just live and breathe and eat and sleep it, then it's all about, it's in you, and, you love doing it. It's not like a chore. And like was just said, it's not work. I don't work for a living because it's so pleasurable. It's wonderful.
Okay. Before I ask any more questions, I want to open it up and see if we've got any in the audience. I guess I have to go to.
Do you want me to read the ones in the chat?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay, so let's see, go to the top here. And Francie asked, this is to Deanna, when Mary Lou Williams took a pause for 3 years in the mid-50s, what impact do you believe that had on the future trajectory of her life?
So I really think that one of the main things, often those 3 years Mary Lou essentially took off from public performance, get framed in a way that says, well, she came out of this thing and she had this conversion, and because she had this breakdown, and then she just disappeared, and then she became ultra religious and wrote sacred music. But I really think what happened with Mary Lou is that she was deliberately taking a time of reflection and retreat, and that made her more confident when she came out of that self-imposed performing hiatus in the work that she did after that point. I mean, she had some interviews where she talked about like when she played in 1957 with Dizzy at Newport, and that was supposedly one of her comebacks, because the press kept saying, 6 years later, they said, Mary Lou's having another comeback. And she didn't feel super confident about that performance. But then about 6 months later, she started doing this run at the Composer, a club on the East Side. And she said she felt like her, and she said this often, she said that her playing had become deeper and felt like a prayer to her. And I really believe that she got more confident. I mean, she always was, but just had a sensibility about the direction of her music that she was starting to lose sight of. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, and I'll mention it now before I forget. Another thing, you know, that I did, and this was in some of the time when I was working on the book, was I was creating a new performance edition of Mary Lou's Third Mass, Music for Peace, for the Mary Lou Williams Foundation. And doing that kind of work, and especially because, so I also, like Mary Lou, I've written a lot of liturgical music and choral music, and really getting into, someone else asked about how her style changed. Well, listening to how Mary Lou played with singers, and then looking at manuscripts when she created like a simplified manuscript for Music for Peace for church directors to do, which not many people have seen this. It came out in like 1971, I believe, and seeing how she notated what she thought other people could play, there were really a lot of decisions I had to make as an editor. So, and as a pianist, and what do I know that people can play, what or not, or what can, for instance, sometimes if Mary Lou just put slash marks, it's not going to be enough for some people. So I would go in and transcribe some of what she did and then have to simplify some of this. But I also believe that's something that Mary Lou was very aware of. And this is again after her 3 years, especially when she starts writing sacred music. She really wants her sacred music, I'm talking about now specifically, she wants to be accessible for other people to be able to perform it. So she's really generous in, you know, allowing other musicians to perform her music. And I'm just going to put this in the chat too. I'm going to be in New York on March 26th doing it's never been done in concert, Mary Lou's second Mass, her Mass for the Lenten season, with a Stonewall Chorale, with a trio and with the choir. So every time I get to do work like this, and I go back and I've looked at Mary Lou's manuscripts, and I've listened to so many different recordings of not just her sacred music, but it's just amazing to me how she adapted her playing to when she was working with non-musicians.
Great, thank you. You know, I think that addressed Joe Ross's question about her Mary Lou's development. Joe also asked, well, he asked for the 50 artists that are in Jordannah's book to where can we see that? That's on the Amazon. I posted the Amazon link, and you can open up the table of contents and see who she's got. I was surprised that Jordannah's answer about who is most unfairly overlooked and neglected despite their accomplishments, her answer is Odetta. And I thought Odetta was pretty broadly known myself. Maybe Jordannah wants to expand on that a little bit. But also let me say, we got a question from Facebook from Anna Sabagil Buddha. I think that means she was in Budapest, perhaps. And she asked, what inspired your journey in writing these books? I think you folks have all addressed that. So let's go back to the Odetta question for a minute. And then we have several other questions. So please be concise, and we'll try to get to everything.
Yeah, well, you know, I have to, thank you, Howard. I have to look through the lens, not only of children, but being born after the 1960s, 70s, you know, I had to discover all of this music on my own, and thank God for technology. I remember seeing Odetta on the Johnny Cash show. And Johnny Cash was really, you know, big on bringing people like Ray Charles and all these things, and also Playboy at Night. These shows who brought Nina Simone on television for the first time. So, you know, I mean, I had to discover these things as a little naturally curious musicologist at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And we have to remember that there is not only an entire generation, but a new culture of kids who who don't even know who Anita Baker is, who don't even, know who Natalie Cole is and Roberta Flack and kind of all of these people. And we're also getting to the point where Beyonce is getting, a little bit outdated. She's not as, she's not selling tickets like she used to. So, I mean, this book is a new entire world of discovery. And I think Odetta is probably the most maybe obscure because we don't see a lot of Black women in folk music. So I do have Tracy Chapman in there, who's kind of a remnant and, but yeah.
Okay, let me ask you further. Talk a little bit about your relationship with Briana. Did you pass things back and forth, or how did you work together?
I didn't even get to connect with Briana. It was through my publisher and her agent, and Briana did the sketches. And once the sketches were done, I gave notes on them. In regards to the realism of the women's faces and posture and hair. Like, unfortunately, we really didn't get to do a deep collaborative connection. And I think it was the Pointer Sisters that we had to really talk about, are we going to do the original 4 or are we going to do the 3? And I had to do the call to do a photo of the original 4. So there were little things like that we had to kind of make a decision on.
Again, Joe Ross is asking about a review on Amazon of your book that's critical because you didn't include Whitney Houston. But
yeah, that guy.
I haven't read the review, but I know you had to be selective. Was it?
Yeah, he gave me 1 star and wrote a really mean review and was really angry. Whitney Houston is a powerful musical vocal figure. If I could be frank, I just felt like she only put out 3 or 4 albums out of her entire career. And we did talk about Whitney, and also, with a lot of the controversy and the drugs, it was just really hard to kind of explain. And I think that parents need to talk to their kids in regards to really how publicized her story was. I don't think a lot of the other women outside of Billie kind of, Natalie Cole, there were some women who struggled with drugs that I wrote about, but I felt that parents needed to kind of work that one out. I don't know if that's fair or not.
Yeah, sure. Why not? I mean, you're the author. Francie has posted something that there is a tribute. This is off topic. I'm sorry, but there's a tribute to Phil Schaap that's been organized by WKCR. Phil Schaap, one of our most esteemed radio broadcasters and jazz journalist who died last year. He's an NEA jazz master, of course. And it's going to be on WKCR from February 1st through February 6th. So I just want to make a point of that while we're, Francie Scanlon, thank you for telling me that. I think that's what we've got in terms of questions, Bob. Do you have anything else for the gang?
Well, I'm curious about next book projects that each might or might not have in mind. So let me go around the group and see. And if you want to say I'm on to other things, that's fine too. But Deanna, what's your next book?
I don't know. I have to write a dissertation, so there's a couple things I'm interested in doing. I really would like to do a book just on Pittsburgh jazz history because there's, as you know, I mean, there's just so much. To me, this is like the next project right now is the record. And I'm also hopefully going to the Schomburg Center next or later in the fall to do work on, this could turn into a book, biography of a composer named Eddie Bonnemere, who was music director at the church where Mary Lou presented her Lenten Mass in 1968. And he has a really interesting career that nobody has really written extensively about.
Okay. Jordannah?
Yes, right now I am just beginning to write a child's introduction to hip hop, which is going to be really exciting. And outside of the music realm, I have a book called Astrology for Black Girls, which is going to be an introduction astrological book for, I mean, these books kind of come about because I didn't have them when I was a girl. And so many people email me and reach out to me about this book, no matter what color they are. She raised her voice and they say, this is a book I wish I would have had when I was a little girl. And I think my publisher really sees that I'm very interested in filling in holes in conversations, and also really recognizing that, you know, uh, Black people and Black girls particularly have been left out of the music canon and lexicon, the conversation, and not really taken as intellectuals. And we can there are many Black women musicologists and historians and all of these things, but we're not um, born and trained as little girls, to be invited into these realms as many, white counterparts are. Hey, kid, you're going to go to Harvard. If you're into music, you're going to make sure you're not going to do composition. You're going to make sure you can teach. There are plans and there are kind of higher aspirations naturally for white children. And I think that just giving Black kids an insight to Western music, Western astrology and astronomy, and looking at hip hop as a legitimate and important genre in the entire canon is what needs to be done, and I'm happy to do it.
Okay. And when that astrology book comes out, when someone says, will you sign my book? You can say, what do you mean sign? Bill, I hope there was a rim shot in there somewhere.
I did a book in 1998 for now defunct Billboard Books called Rockers, Jazzbos, and Visionaries. And it was a collection of interviews that I did for various publications, sectioned off into rockers would be like Keith Richards, Bootsy Collins, different people like that. Jazzbos, I had Wynton and man, I don't even offhand, I could run it down. And Visionaries would be like Brian Eno, Frank Zappa, that kind of stuff. Les Paul I had in there. My publisher floated the idea about doing 25 years later, like a second volume of that, an updated volume. That book came out in 98. So between 98 and present day, I've done, thousands of interviews that I could select and continue that idea. He's also sounded me on doing books on the late guitarist Alan Holdsworth, who was a British virtuosic sort of fusion guy. He was in Tony Williams' Lifetime band and of course had his own group for quite a while. He passed away sadly a few years ago. And also a book on John McLaughlin, who is somebody that I've interviewed maybe 30 times over the last 30 some years. These are things we're just discussing. They were ideas that were brought to me by the publisher. Meanwhile, I'm working on a book on spec for nobody in particular. I'm doing the legwork. I'm just fascinated by this guy and his stories. He's not that maybe well known outside of the niche of jazz, but the drummer Mike Clark, who was in Herbie Hancock's Headhunters and has been on the scene in New York for some decades. He's just a hilarious storyteller. And his thing is interesting because he he was playing professionally at the age of 7 on the Texas blues circuit, like Albert King, Gatemouth Brown. As a little kid, he's got a million stories, playing at Paddock Lounge in New Orleans with Frogman Henry, you know, a million and one stories, as well as leading up to his involvement with Herbie Hancock and becoming a Buddhist and maintaining this interesting dichotomy of being this streetwise cat and this Zen-like Buddhist, which is interesting, straddling those two worlds. I just love his storytelling. He's a hilarious cat. I don't have a publisher, but I have been doing just interviews with him, very similar to how I did it with Pat Martino. With Pat, this of course was pre-pandemic. He lives in South Philly, or lived in South Philly, and I would take the bus to Philly and spend a couple days and just hang out at his house and interview him for 4 hours, take a break, have dinner, come back, do 3 or 4 more hours. And I did that maybe 5 or 6 times and got this book out of it, which is his autobiography, co-authored by me. And similarly, I'm doing that with Mike Clark, but on the phone. He lives, I live in West Hartford now. I moved here a few years ago, and we've done about 10 hours of phone chatting, and it's just, I love listening to his stories. He's funny and he's lived a rich life, and I will work on this and then try to get a publisher later. That's pretty much how I did the Jocko book, my very first book. I just felt compelled to do this book, finished it, and then naively was knocking on doors cold to publishers, you know, going to Warner Books and them going, who is this? Has he slept with Madonna? I mean, why would we put this out? Never heard of this guy. But, you know, it was about a year before it finally came out. And I'm making this book with Mike Clark, and I'm gonna, because I have a track record now, it'll maybe be a lot easier to land a deal with somebody. But first and foremost, I want to get these stories documented and shape it up into a book form, which I'll probably do over the course of this year and see how it comes to fruition.
Okay. And Debbie, in addition to volume 3 of Tasty Jazz Jams, I'm sure you have something or other things in mind.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I think Tasty Jazz Jams 3 will skip a year because in 2022, I have 2 books on the docket. One is fiction, one's nonfiction. And in both cases, I'm taking a virtual trip to Russia. So literary trip. So the first one is going to be, the nonfiction one is some history, some context, and also the scene in musicians who are from Russia now, or, you know, came up, you know, and also for the older ones, you know, their experience with kind of Cold War and playing Western music and all that kind of stuff. The novel is going to be a tongue-in-cheek murder mystery about a smooth jazz saxophonist who was murdered in Brooklyn on a very iconic landmark, we shall say. And the protagonist ends up in Russia doing some research on this and finds out about bone records, you know, X-ray records that were, okay. So that, when I learned about that, I just said, okay, I have to write a book that somehow incorporates this. So some really wild stuff going on in that one. And that's kind of tongue in cheek. That's going to be fun to do. But I start out my books, I have the covers designed, so that inspires me. I come up with a concept, and then I have some great covers for this. So I'm really looking forward to this year. I started one of them.
Okay, well, I want to thank the 4 authors and everybody who attended. And I would just say we're scraping the surface here of the interesting books that have come out in the past year. 3 or 4 dozen that the committee has dealt with and will continue to deal with. And so I want to encourage everyone, in addition to keep listening, which I would always encourage you to do, to keep reading as well. And thank you, and it's all yours, Howard.
Oh, no, it's all yours, Bob. Thank you very much for moderating this. Thanks to Deanna, to Debbie, to Bill, and to Jordannah, of course. If you want to read Jordannah's work, she has published several essays at jjanews.org. We may do another book Zoom after we figure out more about the slate of books nominated for the 2022 Jazz Awards. So please keep your eyes on JJA News and on our Facebook page, and we'll have more programming coming up shortly. Thanks, everybody. As Bob said, keep listening and keep reading. Thanks.
Thank you.